Hi, family. We are continuing our application points from our study of living with purpose on purpose. In our last section, we talked about the fact that we exist because of or out of the personhood of God. We're going to go a step further. That second point, as you remember, is I exist to please God. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse number 9. And when you get a chance, read this text and read it slow and spend some time looking at it. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse number 9, the Bible says, "Therefore we also have as our ambition, whether at home or absent, to be pleasing to him." Part of your purpose and your drive for living for God ought to be to exist to please God. There really is no greater goal in your life as a disciple than to bring pleasure to God. In knowing that we please him, we ought to ask the question, how does this practically play itself out? How does one actualize the notion of being pleasing to God? And I want to offer you three things, three areas in which you and I can make application of what it means to live a life that pleases God. One, we ought to live to please him inwardly. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul describes this ambition. That's a concept of what goes on in your inner heart. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse number 1, Paul again echoes the notion of pleasing God. Pleasing God then in an inward manner ought to be simply saying that, Lord, you have complete access to everything that makes me who I am. My inner being belongs to you. All of my thoughts, all of my emotions, all of my feelings, I relinquish the rights over who I am and I give them to you. I want God to be pleased with me inwardly. I want him to have complete rule over who I am with my thoughts, my heart, my emotions. Let's make that as our ambition. But then number two, not only ought we to make application in pleasing God inwardly, another application is in pleasing God outwardly. In the same beautiful notion of pleasing God, there's a passage in Psalm 19 where David sums it up and says, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." Now, David grabs a hold of an inward drive to please God. But this same David is one who would say, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, standeth in the way of sinners, sitteth in the seat of the scornful." Watch David's description. He goes from the inside out. In Psalm 1, where the text I just quoted, he's describing the fact that not only should God have our inward drive, but everything we do ought to be pleasing to God. The Apostle Paul in Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, a text that we're familiar with, he describes this picture of our lives and our bodies being living sacrifices to God, holy and acceptable. Simply saying that everything that we do then ought to be pleasing to God. Everything we do, not just what we think, but everything we do. Our bodies then are simply tabernacles or a vessel by which God outwardly accomplishes what brings him glory and what brings him pleasure. That's why David would say in Psalm 1, where we walk, where we sit, and with whom we socialize. Think about it then, family. We're driving and we're striving to please God inwardly. Let him have all of your inner being. Outwardly, let him have all of your activity. And let me give you one more. We ought to make it our ambition to please God spiritually. Notice the concept in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 5 and 6. We quote a passage all the time in verse number 6 that simply says, without faith, it is impossible to please him. But in verse number 5 here, have you ever noted that there's a description of Enoch who walked with God and then was no more? Why? Because his life was pleasing to God. Enoch represents this picture of holistic pleasure to God. God loved him because he lived a life that intrinsically and all throughout was one that gave God pleasure. If I'm loving God and God is pleased with me inwardly and God is pleased with me outwardly, then God ought also to be pleased with me spiritually. This is a worship kind of devotion. This is a purpose that says, I live to bring God pleasure in every aspect of who I am. And the worship drive of the disciple is one of the strongest drives. Think about this when you go back and read these passages that will be a part of your study. God ought to get pleasure out of your life as a priest who brings him pleasure. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse number 5. God ought to be pleased with your life as a giver. 3 John in verse number 6. God ought to be pleased through your worship and your praise. Hebrews 13, verse 15 and 16. Even your song is given to God out of a devotion and out of a desire for him to be completely pleased with you. Watch what we're saying, and I want to challenge you. I challenge you that as you work out and apply this particular point in your life, a purpose-driven life that exists to please him, that you give God pleasure inwardly, outwardly, and spiritually. That's your challenge. I want you to take this lesson, live it out, make application. Do me a favor, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, share it with your friends, and click the down arrow so that you can see the notes that support this lesson. That way, every passage that we've referenced, you'll be able to have a little later on. All right. Listen, I'm going to pray for you. You pray for me, and let's watch God change everything around us. God bless you.